Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is John. This report is for the 27th. And, well, just as we pretty much described, it was one of those situations where we had a slight move below the 61% from the daily, and as soon as we got above it, you could see significant support from bigger players. Size got a little bit larger, but that doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily hold. We can already see, minus almost 10 here in the pre-market setup. We're still far below the red line, no crossover, though it is potential to reach that point, minus 20-ish range, that you tend to get a little bit of a reversal. You've had short-term buyers peak up, but at this particular point, it becomes a continuation signal from the longer, broader short run within this construct. So the same situation applies. In this particular case, I was looking for about 34, which is a mid-range point between the 76.31 as a possible top out. I was a little off, and we got up to 35. If we look at the ranges again, you got that 19 and a quarter. Obviously is again below that, and I think that you've got to be thinking 95 is the next stop. And we also have some additional white candle setups that are suggesting, the retrace to 2704, and then one just came in futures overnight, so we'll take a look at that when we get to the 5K chart. Likewise, we can see the NQ is still far better, well above its 61%, has had a bigger up move and a little bit less of the down move, and we're not seeing that wider distribution that you're seeing from the ES, so still holding up better, which that's a little bit of a divergence between those two markets. And the euro hits against that 23% every time. It's got to continue the push here, otherwise it's going to just exhaust this run as well, in which case I would expect we probably break further back into this range and below it. And that's just the difficulties that exist within the euro and where it's set up and the turmoil that's taking place there. Of course, you're going to have an interesting play here for treasuries coming forward, because it's probably going to lift. I know that the yield and stuff was down. There's really some confusing question marks as to what will happen with rates and interest rates in particular over time as far as a yield goes. And it doesn't seem all that confusing when you look at real inflation that most of us do, but they don't obviously go based off of the real world. They have their fantasy numbers. This is a real world situation that will have its impact. It doesn't happen right away. It's going to take its time. We're in the midst of its effects inflationary wise right now, from the move that took place all the way back over here in May. And that's really going to start impacting July, August setup. The little dip, you're probably not even going to feel that, because it takes much longer for things to step down, which is why there really wasn't much relief, gas price or anything like that, simply because it takes much longer to work through the increased price in the inventories. And the hemorrhage in gold, we've seen it. We keep thinking that at some point it's going to be done. Minus 30 on the DOC. It's crazy for reading, but we're just not seeing any interest at all. So let's look at this mess of a 5K chart here. It started off kind of interesting. It's an interesting one right here. The little cyan dots here tend to be little peak out points. We'll see that later on as we move forward. Of course, the yellow represents the extreme histogram reaching near peak points, which would be the obviously positive extreme, where we expect retrace of those values, which tend to happen. So we started off kind of modest throughout the day. We kind of just chopped around, mostly bullish though, because we stayed pretty well above the 50%, and even when we had rising lows, the drawdown really wasn't that significant, which was a little problematic in both ways, because you really weren't making significant new highs or any outward jump like that, and we ended up getting really oversold, which meant that we really have to come back to visit the lows here right around the 16-17 range from this dip below the red line. And from that point, we were above the 50%. Gold candle came in. We went to the highs of the 100%. I had this previous setup here from the white candle at 27.33 range. I was thinking around 34 would be the number for peak out. It turned out to be 35.25 for the peak out number. It wasn't right here that it happened. This was only 34.75, but you can see we ended up with positive extreme, along with the few more of the little blue dots that pop in, signaling areas of interesting algo activity that usually lead to short pumps. They're not always super sustained. It's a little bit difficult from that standpoint, but if you're looking to get started in a situation where usually it's hyper bullish, like in this particular case with Cyan Under, it's an early precursor. I found it very effective. They'll be part of the indicators going into July. I'll have that available for everyone to look at, and we'll go through a synopsis of it. But this leads us to the end of day situation. We started to get some minor DOC spreads right as we were there. We had the steel reset though, which is always a little problematic. Didn't take long for it to reverse right here, which is where you would have the opening of the snake mouth, which is the orange above steel, and particularly with the green coming from above, also produces that favorite scenario. And with that began the little short move. Didn't quite go to the 50 before bouncing back up again, but then it continued its little cave down, and that's just because of this lovely situation. When you get that orange coming back, as it comes up, you expect it to pivot early, typically before the 0 point, and if it doesn't, that usually fails from a long standpoint. You can see right here, we ended up with that pivot that took place right down there, and ended up pivoting right here, and did all those things before it reached the 0, and that gave it a little more sustained up power. This particular one, when you're already at the elevated levels, it had already completed it. We ended up with the gold above 50%, so it didn't really matter at that particular point because you're expecting the high at that level. Here's what we ended up with, though at the end of the situation. White candle, I think, is very unique because it doesn't usually happen here, where you have cyan under red, which is always a long, except for when it's not a long, and that would be in this particular case with the white candle. Not to say that the white candle can't produce a long. We had that one at 2704 that produced this whole run up here as it was, which, again, keep in mind, that is the target range down lower. Well, and interestingly enough, we're getting very close to that fill of the dip below the red line that we have from back over here. Let's see if we can get that to mark the actual value. That would be right there, and then the next bar cross was also. So we have, what is it, 27.17 for a low. Well, we already know we beat that because we have a low here at the 0 at 27.16. So filled the dip below the red line there. We ended up with a dip below the red line here a couple of times, even on this dip down to the 38% right here. So the pop-up that was happening in the after hour just couldn't sustain it. It was just a matter of waiting for the sell signal on that one. In my particular case, positive extreme, massive white candle. I know that's going to get filled back in. I don't mind jumping on those pretty quick. I was already short though from the higher, so it really didn't matter in this particular case, but produced a nice downdraft and now has filled that move there. And again, it becomes critical because now you're below the 27.19 and that 61% level. So at this particular point, your bias would then shift more towards negative until it moves past that. And at that particular point, you've got the 2704 as the white candle retrace, and then obviously the 50% level, which I would imagine even before then, around that 2700, they're probably going to start adding into their support. We'll see at that particular time how much that goes through, because then if you get a downdraft, you could break below the 96 just a little bit, and that would really be a crisis point check, because you're towards the end of the month, and will there be interested buyers or not, or will they just let it cascade? So it's going to be exciting. I think we're looking forward to seeing how that plays out. As always, though, trade well. I will keep putting up these kind of charts on Skype chat.